Hello everyone. If you constantly work with spreadsheets and large data sets, you are probably already familiar with pivot table and how powerful it is in helping you read and analyze your data. And especially if you work in advertising and PPC ads, I already have a video in my channel to show you how to use pivot tables to analyze your campaign performance. In this video, I'm going to show you some additional tips about how to adjust the layout and settings of your pivot tables so that you can make it even more powerful for yourself and make better and faster decisions. Let's start. When you first build your pivot table, obviously you are going to play around with your columns, metrics, and rows and dimensions to read data that you want to look at the different data from different perspectives. One challenge with that is that anytime you add or remove any column or any metric to your pivot table, the size of your columns will change. Right now, I have increased the width of my columns to make it easier for myself to read data. I don't want them to be too compact. But right now, if I add one new metric to my values, let's try. I'm adding cost to my pivot table. As you see, the size of columns becomes smaller. It fits automatically with the values in that column. I have to adjust them manually. Or similarly for rows, if I remove or add any dimension from my rows, it's going to auto fit the width size of my columns. I don't like this very much. I would prefer to just fix the column size one time and it stays always like that regardless of any change that I make to my pivot table. That's a very easy fix. Just anywhere on your pivot table, right click and click on this option, pivot table options. Here in the bottom of the first page, there is this option called AutoFit Column Widths on Update. All you need to do is just deselect this option. By deselecting that, your columns won't auto-adjust anymore. Let's try. Now, if I increase the size of my columns, if I remove any column from my pivot table, the size stays fixed. Similarly, if I add any new column or if I add a new dimension to my rows. Sometimes you might add some formulas or calculated fields to your pivot table, and depending on the values in your default metrics, the calculated field might show as an error. For example, here in my CPA column, I have it is a calculated field. The way it is calculated is based on cost divided into conversions. Some of my cells, my values are showing as error. For example, in this one, row 29, country France, because I have 0 conversions, so my CPA is showing as an error. This might happen a lot of times. Sometimes you might get errors in the values of your formulas. And if the number of those errors become a lot, it makes it hard for you to read your data. And it's not very nice to use as a reporting if you want to share that data with another person. It's very easy to remove these errors to show it as a blank or anything else. Right click on your pivot table, click on pivot table options. In the first page, layout and format, the first window. In the format section, for error values in show, you can select that. By default, it is gray, it's deselected. You can select that And if you can put anything that you want to show as when there is an error in your formula. And if you just wanted to show it as a blank cell, just leave it blank, don't type anything. Now, if I press OK, as you can see, my error is shown as blank now. It is a very more cleaner and more convenient when reading data. A lot of times in pivot table, you might want to filter data depending on what you are looking in your main data set. So you can only see data for that specific part of data set. For example, here in my pivot table in this data set, I have a column or dimension for countries or regions, shows me the performance of campaigns in that country or in that region. Or I have a column for segments, shows me the performance based on whether I am targeting branded keywords, generic keywords, or competitor keywords. Similarly, I have a column for campaign group, which shows me which campaign I am using and which campaign I want to look. Now, let's say I just want to look at the campaign performance in the country of US. So to do that, you can filter your data in your pivot table columns. Open this filtering option, deselect everything and just select US country. Now I'm filtering data for US only. Similarly, in my segment, I just want to look at the performance of generic campaigns, not branded or competitor keyword. I deselect everything and select generic campaigns. And in my campaign group or campaign column, I can select which campaign I want to look. Maybe not all generic campaigns, only some specific parts. Filtering is a powerful option in pivot table to help you read the data that you are specifically looking for insights in, but there is still a way to make it even more powerful and more convenient for yourself. Here in my pivot table, let me go and remove all the filters that I just selected. I want to look at all the data without any filtering. To make filtering easier for yourself, you have an option to add some slicers in pivot table. What are slicers? Slicers are some windows, additional window at the top that makes filtering easier for you. How does it work? In your pivot table, just click anywhere on in your pivot table. On your Excel menu at the top, click an Analyze option, and there is this option for Insert Slicer. I will click on that. Now, in my slicer, I will have the list of all my columns in my main dataset. I can choose which columns I want to add a slicer for. Let's say I want to add a slicer for region. If I select region, press OK, this window will appear in my screen, in my spreadsheet. Let me add in a few blank rows at the top of my table. So now, if I want, let's say, to look at only data for the country of Canada, all I need to do is just select Canada in my slicer. Here, my data will change and show me data for Canada only. The good thing with the slicer is that you can use multiple slicers and mix them together. Let me go back to the slicer window, click on Analyze on the top menu of your Excel window, click on Insert Slicer. I already have one slicer for regions. I can add new slicers. Let's say I want to add one for segment, one for campaign names, and even for months, which months I want to look at. Now I have 4 slicers in my Excel. Now I am looking at data for only Canada. In other slicer, let's say segment, I just want to look at generic keywords. I don't want to look at branded and competitors for now. That's where I'm looking for. Click on generic. Now my pivot table only shows data for generic. As you see, it is filtered based on generic segment. In my campaign group, I have 5 campaign in my generic segment. I want to look only at 3 of them. Let's say coaching. I hold a control button in my Windows laptop keyboard, coaching, training, and upskilling. Now my data is filtered to show the data, the options that I only want to look at. Even in months name, I have data for all 12 months of the year in my main dataset. If I want to look only at the specific months, let's say past 3 months, I only select those 3 months. Now I am looking at the data for the past 3 months for these 3 campaigns in one country, Canada. If I want to look at other countries, I add them to my pivot table. Slicers are very convenient. They can really help you work faster in your pivot tables. They are very time saving and easier to see everything, all filters visually. I have adjusted the layout of my pivot table to compare revenue performance in different regions in 2 consecutive months, September 2025 versus October 2025. Now, I want to write a formula to compare months over months performance to see whether the revenue increased in each region or not. I'm going to write my formula to see months over months performance for the first country, for the first region, Asia. And I will change it to percentage. Now my first formula correct. I can see that the revenue for this region increased 6% from September to October. Now, normally in this situation, it's very possible that you just drag your formula to the bottom to apply the same formula across multiple cells. The problem with pivot table is that when you drag the formula, it doesn't apply to the bottom values, bottom rows. As you see, after I drag my formula, all of them show the same number, 6%. All of them show only data for these 2 values for the row 11 where I first wrote my formula. There are 2 ways that you can adjust that. First, instead of starting with the first row of data in your table, start with title, with the headers. The headers are months here. I'm going to write my formula again, the same formula here for months over months performance. Obviously, the first one doesn't mean anything. I'm going to change it to percentage. It shows as 0% because they are not numbers. But now, if I drag my formula to the rows below that header, it will apply the correct formula to each row. My months over months revenue for the row 11, the first region shows 6% improvement. Second region, as you can see, 27% decrease in revenue. So this is one way you can address this problem with dragging and writing formulas. Another way is just going to select anywhere in your pivot table at the top menu, click on Analyze. On the left side, pivot table name, there is an option below that. Click on the arrow next to option. There is this text, generate get pivot data. By default, it is selected in your Excel sheet. If you click on that, it will be selected. As you see, it's not selected anymore. Now, my formulas that I write outside pivot table based on the values of my pivot table should be written correctly. Let's try again. I don't need to start with the headers anymore. I go away and start with my first column, row. Let's write down the formula once again. The first one, correct. Now, if I drag down my formula, it's dragged down correctly. The values will be dragged down based on the uh, related months. So this was two ways to address the problem of writing formulas outside the pivot table based on the values in your pivot table. A lot of times when working in pivot tables, you need to update or refresh your original raw data to include new data in your pivot table. For example, here in this pivot table, I have data from January to October 2025. Right now that I'm recording this video is almost at the end of November 2025. So now I have received data for November, and I would like to add November data in my raw data so it can include it in the pivot table. Going back to the tab for the raw data, as you can see, the data ends on October 25. I have a new Excel file. This is the new Excel file. It includes data only for November. So first, I need to copy the new data to my pivot table raw data. Just copy and paste it. And I'm adding the formulas too. When I go back to my pivot table in the refresh button, if I refresh the pivot table, the data for November, the new data that I just added to my raw data is not going to be included because my data source ends at the end of the previous data, row 435470, which is where my October data ends. So if I want to uh, include my new data to pivot table, I need to change the data range manually. The end of date range needs to be my last row in the new raw data, which here is 457468. If I press OK, and in my pivot table, you can see the November data is added. If you do this process multiple times, and if your data contains lots of data like mine, it can become sometimes frustrating and also prone to errors, mistakes, to change the last row manually each time. So what you can do to change your raw data from a data range to a table. If I make these columns into a table, and it can update automatically and solve my problem. By table, I don't mean going here and just add a table border. No, not a border. And just select somewhere in your raw data, in the home tab in your Excel file, there is this option called format as table. I click that, and you can choose whatever layout and coloring that you like. I just for example, I select this one, make sure that the end row is selected, the last row is selected in my data range for table, and OK. Now my date, raw data has turned into a table, and the name here on the top left is called table 1. Now in my pivot table, the data source, I need to change my data source from range to a table. I just write the name of my table. It was called table 1. Okay. Okay, this is November 2025. Now, if I add any new data to the end of my raw data, let's remove November data and add it again. I need to find November data manually. Let's remove this part, all of the November data to the very end. It's deleted. Again, my data, raw data is only until October 2025. And if I refresh my pivot table, it should show data from January to October. So now again, I go to my new file 4 that contains only November data. I add this new November data, just copy and paste at the end of my raw data, which is now a table. I just copy the new data, and this new data by default will be added to my existing table. In my pivot table, all I need to do is just refresh the pivot table, and by default, it will add any new data which is added to my raw data table, I don't need to change data source every time anymore. And this is very pretty interesting feature, interesting trick to make it easier for you, to make it more convenient and less error when you constantly update the source of your pivot table, so you don't have to change the data source manually each time. I hope you found all these tips about pivot table that I discussed in this video helpful. I find them personally very helpful. They help me to do my work, my day-to-day work, more efficient and faster. If you have any questions about pivot table and PPC advertising in general, feel free to let me know in comments. Thank you for watching this video.